a biased and prejudiced teacher, a classroom filled with tension, and a twist that no one saw coming. It's about to reveal years of hidden bias, uncovering what has long been buried. Get ready for a story that will make you rethink what truly happens behind the closed doors of a school. The bell rang, marking the start of another day at Eastgate High. Mrs. Jackson stood at the front of her literature class, her stern eyes scanning the room as the students quietly took their seats. The air was thick with an unspoken tension that always seemed to follow her lessons. But before we dive into what happens next, I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from today? Drop a comment below. Just as the last few students hurried in, a new face appeared at the door. Maya Thompson walked in, her backpack slung casually over one shoulder. The other students watched her, some with curiosity, others with uncertainty. Mrs. Jackson's lips pursed tightly as she watched Maya take a seat. "Well, well," Mrs. Jackson said, her voice laced with false sweetness. "It seems we have a new addition to our class. I do hope you're able to handle our challenging curriculum." The word challenging carried an unmistakable tone of doubt. Maya met her gaze with calm, but chose to stay quiet. As Mrs. Jackson turned back to the board, a storm seemed to gather under the surface, the atmosphere thick with tension. What happens when a teacher's prejudice meets a student's quiet resilience? Maya's next move could shift everything. Mrs. Jackson cleared her throat, her gaze locking onto Maya. "Today we'll be exploring the themes of power and oppression in To Kill a Mockingbird*. Who would like to begin?" Her eyes swept the room, deliberately skipping over Maya's raised hand. After calling on several other students, Mrs. Jackson finally acknowledged Maya with a forced smile. "Yes, Miss Thompson. Do you have something to share?" Maya sat up straighter, her voice calm and confident. "I believe the novel reflects the realities of systemic racism." "Systemic racism?" Mrs. Jackson interrupted, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I think you're confusing this American classic with modern political rhetoric." A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. Some students shifted uneasily while others smirked, anticipating the growing tension. Maya took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk. "With all due respect, Mrs. Jackson, the racial injustice in the book is meant to mirror—" "That's enough!" Mrs. Jackson cut her off again with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Perhaps you should focus on understanding the text as it is, rather than pushing your own interpretations." The tension in the room thickened. Maya's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, her gaze unwavering. The quiet defiance in her posture seemed to unsettle Mrs. Jackson further. Mrs. Jackson turned back to the whiteboard, her marker squeaking loudly as she wrote, "Now let's discuss the true themes. Who can explain the symbolism of the mockingbird?" As the lesson continued, Mrs. Jackson deliberately ignored every attempt Maya made to participate. Each time Maya raised her hand, Mrs. Jackson's gaze slid past her as if she wasn't there. The message was clear. Maya's voice didn't belong in this room. The other students began to notice. Some exchanged nervous glances, their discomfort growing with each passing moment, while others seemed to feed off Mrs. Jackson's behavior, casting sly smiles in Maya's direction. Despite the growing frustration evident in Maya's posture and the tightness around her eyes, she remained composed. Her pen moved steadily across her notebook as she took notes, a quiet act of resistance, her refusal to be silenced or excluded from her own education. As the class neared its end, Mrs. Jackson announced a group project. "I'll be assigning the groups," she said, her tone filled with implication. "We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place." The weight of her words hung in the air. Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the challenge for what it was. She squared her shoulders and met Mrs. Jackson's gaze with a calm determination. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, the students began to pack up and leave. Maya, however, moved at her own pace, deliberately unhurried. Just as she reached the door, Mrs. Jackson called out, "Miss Thompson, a word." Maya turned, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Mrs. Jackson?" The teacher's smile was thin and cutting. "I hope you understand that in my class, we focus on facts and analysis, not personal opinions or agendas. I would hate to see you struggle because you can't separate your emotions from the material. As the days passed, Mrs. Jackson's initial hesitation hardened into something colder, an unwavering resolve to show Maya exactly who held the authority in this classroom. She would make sure Maya understood, no matter the cost. The next class would reveal the depths of her prejudice, putting Maya's quiet strength to the ultimate test. The following week, Maya walked into the classroom, her head held high, bracing herself for whatever was to come. Mrs. Jackson stood at the front of the room, her eyes narrowing as Maya took her seat. The atmosphere crackled with tension, like the air before a storm. As the lesson began, Mrs. Jackson's scrutiny of Maya intensified. Every movement, every word, was subject to sharp criticism. "Miss Thompson, is that gum you're chewing?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Maya paused, her hand halfway to her mouth. She wasn't chewing gum at all. "No, Mrs. Jackson, But Mrs. Jackson interrupted. "Don't lie to me, young lady. Spit it out now." Her voice was drenched with disdain. The other students shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding eye contact, while others watched with a kind of morbid curiosity. Maya stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. She walked to the trash can, mimed spitting out imaginary gum, and then quietly returned to her seat. The silence that followed was thick and oppressive. As the class continued, Mrs. Jackson's behavior became more brazen. She criticized every detail of Maya's participation, from her handwriting to her posture. "Sit up straight, Miss Thompson. This is a classroom, not some casual hangout spot," Mrs. Jackson barked, ignoring the fact that Maya's posture was no different from her classmates. The tension in Maya's jaw was visible, her fingers gripping her pen tightly as she fought to keep her composure under the relentless attacks. Each breath she took was measured, a conscious effort to maintain her calm. But something was shifting in the classroom. The students were beginning to notice the clear targeting of Maya. Some exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort growing with each passing moment. Others, however, seemed emboldened by Mrs. Jackson's behavior, subtly feeding off the teacher's antagonism. Maya, however, remained composed. Though her frustration was evident, she held firm, refusing to let the teacher break her spirit. Each word she spoke, each note she took, was an act of resistance, a silent declaration that she would not be silenced, no matter the pressure placed on her. The classroom dynamics were beginning to shift. Some students, once passive observers, were starting to question the teacher's actions, while others leaned into the growing divide. The tension was rising, and it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. Some students, like Emily in the front row, shot sympathetic glances at Maya when Mrs. Jackson wasn't looking. Others, emboldened by the teacher's actions, joined in with snickers and whispered remarks. During a group discussion, Maya raised her hand to contribute. Mrs. Jackson's lips curled into a cold smile. "Yes, Miss Thompson, please enlighten us with your unique perspective," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Maya's voice was steady as she began to speak, but Mrs. Jackson cut her off almost immediately. "I'm sorry. Could you enunciate more clearly? We can't all understand certain dialects." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Maya's eyes widened, her hands clenching into fists beneath her desk. The racism, once thinly veiled, was now out in the open, ugly and undeniable. As the bell rang to signal the end of class, Mrs. Jackson called out, "Miss Thompson, please stay behind. We need to discuss your performance." Maya approached the teacher's desk, her heart pounding, but her expression remained neutral. Mrs. Jackson looked up, her eyes cold. "I hope you understand, Miss Thompson, that your attitude is becoming problematic. If you can't adapt to the standards of this class, perhaps you should consider a more suitable environment." The weight of her words hung in the air like a threat. Maya took a deep breath, her voice calm but firm. "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Jackson. I'll continue to do my best, as I always have." As she turned to leave, Mrs. Jackson called after her, "Oh, and Miss Thompson, don't forget your group project presentation is due next week. I do hope you're prepared." Maya nodded, her mind already racing. She knew this presentation would be a critical moment. Mrs. Jackson was undoubtedly planning to use it as a chance to humiliate her in front of the class, but Maya was determined not to give her the satisfaction. As the days passed, the day of the presentation arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation. Maya stepped to the front of the room, her heart steady, her resolve strong. She had spent countless hours preparing, determined to deliver a flawless presentation despite Mrs. Jackson's attempts to undermine her. Behind her, the project board displayed a meticulously researched analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing on the themes of racial injustice and moral courage. As Maya began her presentation, Mrs. Jackson's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smirk. She watched Maya like a predator stalking its prey, her pen tapping impatiently against her grading sheet. The other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension in the room. Halfway through her presentation, Maya paused to answer questions. Mrs. Jackson's hand shot up immediately. "Miss Thompson," she drawled, her voice laced with mock sweetness, "I'm curious about your choice of focus. Don't you think you're overemphasizing certain aspects of the novel?" Maya's brow furrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I believe the racial themes are central to understanding the book's message." Mrs. Jackson's smirk deepened, and she leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with intent. "Is that so? Perhaps you're reading too much into it, Miss Thompson. Don't you think you're projecting your own views onto the text, rather than interpreting it objectively?" The class fell silent, all eyes on Maya. She could feel the weight of her classmates' gazes, the tension thickening. But Maya stood tall, refusing to back down. "With all due respect, Mrs. Jackson," she said calmly, "literature is meant to be analyzed through multiple lenses. The racial themes are evident in the text and are widely recognized by scholars. My interpretation is not personal. It's grounded in both the text and historical context." A flicker of surprise crossed Mrs. Jackson's face, quickly replaced by a hard, cold stare. "Well, we'll see what your grade reflects," she said dismissively, turning her attention back to her notes. But the room had shifted. Maya's strength had not gone unnoticed. Some students, once silent, now sat up a little straighter, emboldened by her courage. Others, who had smirked or whispered before, now looked uncomfortable, unsure of their earlier complicity. As Maya returned to her seat, a quiet determination settled over her. She had faced Mrs. Jackson's prejudice head-on, and while the teacher still held the power to grade her, Maya knew that in that moment she had already won a deeper victory. The classroom dynamics had shifted, and the seeds of change had been planted. As the weeks passed, the prejudice Maya faced from Mrs. Jackson only intensified. The whispered comments and sharp remarks became a routine in the classroom. Maya endured it with quiet strength, refusing to let it break her spirit. She knew she had a long-term strategy, even if her classmates were unaware. Only a few students close to her knew that her father, Mr. Thompson, was the mayor of the state, but Maya kept it private, wanting to handle the situation on her own terms. One afternoon, after school had ended, Mr. Thompson sent his personal assistant, Mr. Baker, to pick Maya up from class. Maya had stayed behind to work on a group project, and when Mr. Baker arrived, he noticed the tension in the room. Mrs. Jackson, as usual, was speaking to Maya in a condescending tone, nitpicking her every word. Mr. Baker watched, his expression darkening as he quickly realized what was going on. Without saying a word, he left the classroom and made a call to the mayor. That evening, Mr. Baker reported everything he had witnessed to the mayor. Mr. Thompson listened carefully, his face growing more serious with every detail. Though Maya had never directly complained to him, he trusted his assistant's account completely. He knew it was time to take action. The next morning, to the shock of everyone in the school, Mayor Thompson walked through the doors of the building. His presence was commanding, and word quickly spread that the mayor was on campus. Mrs. Jackson, unaware of who Maya's father was, carried on with her usual behavior as the day went by. She had no idea that her class was about to receive a visitor. When the door to the classroom opened and Mayor Thompson stepped inside, a hush fell over the room. Mrs. Jackson's eyes widened in surprise, and she nervously smoothed down her blouse. "Good afternoon, everyone," Mr. Thompson said, his voice calm yet authoritative. I'm here to observe this class, and I have a few matters to discuss. He turned his gaze to Mrs. Jackson, who swallowed hard. Mrs. Jackson, may I have a word with you in private? He asked, his tone leaving no room for refusal. She nodded, her face pale as she led him to a corner of the room. The students sat in stunned silence, whispering to each other as they realized that the mayor had come because of Maya. In their private conversation, Mr. Thompson was direct but composed. I've been made aware of the treatment my daughter Maya has been subjected to in this classroom, he said, his eyes locked on Mrs. Jackson's. Your bias and prejudice will no longer be tolerated. Mrs. Jackson stammered, trying to defend herself, but Mr. Thompson raised a hand, silencing her. I have already spoken to the school board, he said calmly. You are being suspended effective immediately while a formal investigation is conducted. I suggest you leave the premises. Mrs. Jackson, shaken and at a loss for words, gathered her things and quickly exited the classroom. The students watched in stunned silence, not believing what had just happened. Mayor Thompson turned to the class, his expression softening as he looked at his daughter. I hope this serves as a reminder to all of you. Prejudice and injustice, no matter how subtle, must be confronted. Maya has shown more grace and strength than most of us could imagine, but no one should have to endure what she has. He placed a hand on Maya's shoulder and gave her a nod. As he left the classroom, the atmosphere was charged with a new energy. The students looked at Maya with newfound respect. She had not only stood her ground, but had done so with dignity, and her father's swift action had brought the situation to a dramatic conclusion. From that day forward, the dynamics in the classroom changed. Mrs. Jackson never returned, and the school appointed a new teacher, one who fostered an inclusive and supportive environment. Maya continued to excel, not just in her studies but in earning the admiration of her peers. She had proven that strength in the face of adversity could spark change, and she carried that lesson with her for the rest of her life. Leave a comment if you enjoyed this story. It doesn't cost you anything, and you'll make me very happy. Thank you, and I look forward to your like.